Sorry, I ordered sushi. Just give me 1 second. I never have the water, though. Gracias. I begin with a puzzle. And sorry for that brief interruption. Why is it safer in so many parts of the world today to eat sushi than to drink tap water? Think about it. Sushi is, if you had spoken to our ancestors about it, would have agreed that it's kind of a disgusting thing. It's an uncooked fish. If you've ever seen these videos of sushi markets, you know that this is not something you want to mess with. And yet we just, all around the world, eat raw fish like it's nothing. But we can't manage to have clean water coming out of our taps in most countries in the world. So I want to talk to you today about something that I'm going to call the sushi water paradox. Before I do that, I have to acknowledge that when I was invited to speak here, and I'm delighted to speak here, I was warned that half the people would be listening and half would be drunk. I now understand that the more proper analysis is that there's really two conferences. There's the front, where people are hoping to raise money tonight. And then there's the back, where people are hoping to make love tonight. So you guys are the very loyal, dedicated, and, fundraising ones. And so thank you for being in the front. And a big shout out to our lovemaking friends in the back. Now, I know this is a conference for and about innovation and technology. And you probably wish I would just give you some of my hot stock tips and then let you join the lovemaking crowd back there. But I'm a writer, and if I gave you my stock tips, you would lose whatever money you have. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to not do what others have done in addressing you in your capacity as investors, entrepreneurs, innovators. I want to speak to you in a different capacity of yours, which is as leaders of the developing world. You may not see yourself in those exalted terms, but I see you in those terms. And I want to talk to you in that capacity of yours. I think that in addition to being business people and pursuing your business ambitions, all of you have an enormous role to play in deciding what the developing world becomes over the next generation and seizing what I'm going to argue to you is a truly historic, once-in-many-centuries moment. So I want to talk to you today, getting back to the sushi, about what it means to be a modern country, what it really means to be a modern country, and what we sometimes, when we get a little lazy, think it means to be a modern country. I have spent no time in Uruguay until this week, so I'm really talking about the countries that I have worked in and reported from across the developing world. Now, sushi. When I go to far-flung countries, Africa, South America, Asia, there's always sushi. Everywhere in the world, sushi. Sushi in Nigeria, I've had that. In India, in Colombia, Argentina, I even had some here. China, that's at least not too far away. Now, there are two ways to react to discovering sushi in Nigeria. The first way to react is to say, great, sushi. But the more relevant reaction might be to say, who decided that Nigeria needed sushi before it needed drinkable tap water? Who decided, let's solve this problem first, a lack of access to Japanese expensive raw fish, and once we have solved that, we will make sure people can drink water. This is the sushi water paradox. And the key to understanding this paradox, I think, is what I'm going to call tonight, and this is new material just for you guys. And if it doesn't go well, it will be new material only for you guys. It's based on what I call the sushi theory of progress. So here's the sushi theory of progress, and maybe you recognize this in some of the places where you have worked and lived. In the sushi theory of progress, progress means worrying first about having things like sushi in your country, and only much later worrying about the basics of human development. Progress is the glossy end of things before the basic beginnings. So in the sushi theory of progress, you fly in the raw fish from Japan first and you worry about tap water later. In the sushi theory of progress, you create fashionable startup incubators in your city, and only much later do you make it easy for the average person to start an average, unfashionable business in your country. In the sushi theory of progress, iPhones become very easily available in the country, and only much later do you worry about creating the kind of legal system and courts that allowed a company like Apple to be built. What I want to suggest to you today is that the sushi theory of progress, which is very popular among people like us, if we're going to be honest, is actually very dangerous for developing countries. It creates a kind of progress that actually isn't progress at all. But it creates something that looks so much like progress that most of us don't notice what's missing. I'm speaking to you about this because I think you might notice what's missing, and you might be the people who have opportunities to rethink these things in your societies. And I think you can play a role in reshaping aspirations in your societies, what people dream of doing, not just how they do them. So, part of the reason I said a moment ago that I think you all are very important to this discussion, why I chose to talk about this with you, is that I think we're at a huge transformative moment in world affairs. And most of you, if you're like my startup friends back home, you're very focused on what you're building right now. So I'm going to let you stay focused on that, but I'm just going to take a minute to tell you how I see what you're doing. To me, this is the end of a 500-year period in human history that the world was basically run out of the United States and Europe. Europe first, then the US. Look at languages around the world, look at power, look at political ideas, look at philosophy, look at fashion, look at everybody wearing jeans tonight. A very small piece of the world has dictated terms, dictated ideas, dictated practices to most of the world for the last 500 years. I would argue to you that that period is coming to an end right now. Now, when you're working in the trenches of whatever you're working on, you're not thinking about that. You're just thinking about the thing you're doing. But if you step back, the West is tired, exhausted, bloated, riddled with debt, unable to deal with its own problems, and certainly in much less of a mood than it used to be to worry about the rest of the world. At the same time, countries from this continent to Asia to Africa are suddenly now being spoken of as the new frontiers of innovation and change and growth in the world. This does not happen very often. It certainly does not happen often in history that all of these places, from Brazil to China to Kenya, are talked about in the same moment in time as finally claiming their destiny, at a moment when the people in charge are losing hold of their destiny. But the problem is, in the developing world, there was a tendency to just look at what was done in the global north or the west or whatever you want to call it and copy it or bring it home. And there was a tendency to borrow someone else's idea of a modern country. And then, you know, when you make a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, you end up with a very diminished picture of someone else's idea of a modern country, and then you try to apply it to your country, and it does not fit the culture, it does not fit the history, it doesn't fit the practices, and what you end up with is the sushi theory of progress. So let's talk about going beyond the sushi understanding of modernity. And I think leaders like you have a role to wake up your own societies and start a conversation. With all respect to the startups we saw, they're very impressive, but a lot of them were, this has worked in America, let's bring it here. I'm actually much more interested in what has never even been tried in America and comes out of Brazil. I'm much more interested in how Uruguayans have thought about a problem that nobody else in the world thought about because they didn't have the situation of Uruguay. But actually the problem is universal in some deep way, and people in China and Cambodia and India can solve some unfulfilled need because Uruguay gets to tell the world their story. That's actually the wave of startups that would be most inspiring to me. But if we're going to get there, we have to stop importing sushi, and we have to start asking what our own definitions of progress and modernity are in our own societies. Now, a big part of why we don't do this is that in the developing world, when our societies don't necessarily work for us, what do? We often solve the problem just for ourselves or our family without fixing it for the society. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So what do we do in developing countries when we have children who are too bright for our own universities? We send them to Harvard or Oxford instead of asking, how hard could it be to have a Harvard or an Oxford? What do we do in developing countries when our newspapers fail to cover the world with the depth or wisdom that we want to see? We subscribe to The Economist instead of asking, how hard could it be to make an economist? What do we do in developing countries when the electricity supply fails to deliver? We import the finest backup generators made in Germany, and we don't worry about the fact that our country still doesn't have the ability to deliver electricity. So in the new world that's coming, I would argue to you that it's time to change these habits. It's time to start reinventing our societies in the developing world, not work around their shortcomings, and to be active producers of this human future, not passive consumers of it. I want to briefly talk about 3 specific areas where I think all of you, as young leaders of this emerging world, can make a difference. The first of these 3 issues has to do with where I began, with the sushi water paradox when I watered the lawn here. And it has to do with the question of, what do you think it actually means to be a modern country today? This does not involve reading books about other people's ideas, but these are conversations that you all should start having in all the countries where you live and work, and ask yourselves and ask your friends and talk over lunch and dinner, and start to think about when we have everything we want as a society, when our taps work perfectly and we have X GDP and nobody is hungry, and when we get there, what do we want the there to look like? Because actually there's a choice. There's all kinds of different societies you can end up with. And at the heart of that is to get beyond the association of modernity with sushi, but also with a certain style of boutique hotel, a fashion week. Everybody wants a fashion week. Uzbekistan wants a fashion week. 3G data connections, cheap laptops. Everybody wants all those things. Every developing country is trying to build a really cheap laptop. I see very few developing countries where people are trying to say, how can we make heart surgery $100 so people could actually have it if they needed to and not die of preventable things? I think of traveling to Dubai recently. They have an indoor ski slope with real snow inside a mall. Any of you heard of this or seen it maybe? Now, Dubai's court and legal system is so terrible that people get arrested there all the time for no reason. They get kicked out of the everybody's living in fear. Everybody that I spoke to was afraid. And you just think, what are we doing? Who decided, to go back to the original question, who decided to solve the problem of the lack of ski access in Dubai and said, you know what, let's do this, and then once we do that, we'll take some of the best and brightest people who worked on that and we'll have them come up with a modern legal system. Sometimes it seems to me in a lot of the developing countries I visit, there's actually a misunderstanding of what actually made the countries that they admire so successful. There's a tendency in particular to ignore the role of great institutions, and often public institutions or kind of public-private institutions like universities, in the development of the advanced countries. Institutions are potentially unsexy. At a conference like this, startups, very sexy, very exciting. But the things that actually made a lot of the great powers great were their universities, their patent offices, their zoning regulations, their park services, their libraries, their court systems, their newspapers, their think tanks. How many of your friends want to work in those kinds of jobs? Not a lot. Everybody wants to do a startup, or everybody wants to work at a consulting firm, everybody wants to work in banking, and that's fine. But what made a lot of these countries what they were was the strength and vigor of their public systems and their institutions. And so my first challenge to all of you is to think about your role in building great institutions for your societies and fighting for great institutions and creating the conditions for a truly great society that is modern from the bottom all the way up, not just at the top. Second, I think there's a hugely important role for leaders of your generation in the developing world to completely reinvent what the West got very wrong, which is the relationship of the individual to the community. It's often argued that the greatest thing about Europe and the US and the reason that they were able to run the world as they have is that they put the individual and the individual's rights and dignities at the center of everything. And that is a truly remarkable thing. It is probably what allowed for that kind of unprecedented success. But if you travel in some of these countries today, these Western countries, you will find that in many, many ways, this idea and this obsession with the individual has crashed. No one can look at the divorce rates of the most advanced economies and conclude that the liberation of the individual has ended very well in that regard. There's no developing country I have ever been to that wants an American divorce rate. They want to begin the road of liberation, but nobody wants an American divorce rate. No one can look at the poverty levels of the richest country in the world, the United States, and conclude that the doctrine of free market individualism as practiced there is perfect. No one can look at the complete disappearance of the family in many parts of the global north and conclude that freeing the individual should result in this. So here is the opportunity for those of you who live in the countries now going through this modernization journey to be part of a discussion and a dialogue in your countries about your own alternative way of thinking about how to free individuals from class and family and feudal ties, and yet still to preserve some kind of idea of community and family and togetherness, which I know is so important in this society and in so many of the societies that are in the early stages or middle stages of that modernization journey. Third, money. One of the things that I have observed across the developing world, now that so many parts of it are growing and dynamic and changing themselves very quickly, is a tendency sometimes towards an unhealthy and even a toxic relationship with the idea of money. Money often has come into these societies extremely quickly, much more quickly than it came into Western countries, which grew more organically over a much slower period. People are unprepared for this sudden infusion of money. It completely changes the culture very quickly. People fall in love with it. And if you're not careful, you end up with ruined societies, societies in which money becomes the only god, and all institutions and cultures and practices fall away under the violent pressure of it. And the reason this seems to happen in many developing countries is that you have a lot of deep and unresolved traumas and tensions and problems, whether it's the caste system in India or apartheid in South Africa or feudalism in many parts of the developing world, communism in China. And these were very hard and damaging periods of history that left a lot of people with a lot of resentments and bitterness and unresolved issues. And then money suddenly comes in, and it becomes, in this very strange way, the solution to all of these unresolved historical traumas. Think of Russia, above all, a mass traumatized society that overnight went from communism to the most extreme form of capitalism in the world, more capitalist than any capitalist country would proclaim itself to be, overnight. And look what happened in Russia. In many of these societies, money acquires this special significance that makes it more than just money. It becomes a way of changing your fate. It becomes a way where you don't trust your government, of protecting your family. It becomes, in places with a lot of violence, a way of making sure you can buy a metal cage in your house around your bedroom to protect your wife and daughters at night. Money acquires this almost poetic, mythical significance as something that can help you overcome all the problems of the past. And these uses of money are often very good and powerful, but in societies that experience this sudden rush of money and growth, and I've spent time in many of them, money becomes sacred to the exclusion of almost everything else. And if you aren't careful, it's easy to end up with a society that goes having too little money to a society that goes to being too obsessed and centered on money. And it's possible to lose your culture in the balance and sell it for money. It's possible to use the new money that comes to cut yourself off from others, from family, from connections, instead of building them. And so I speak to you once again as builders and leaders of your countries, as leaders in this new world that I think of as a world without a center for the first time in 500 years. You have a choice in your intimate sphere of family, friends, in your work life about what problems to work on, what startups to found, what companies to invest in. And all I want to do is to argue to you that some of these things are as or more deserving of your attention as simple replication of the West's lessons. So here's what I want to say to you in conclusion. You heard a lot about how to be better business people from the previous speakers and a lot about Israel, so you don't need me for that. I came here to see if I could convince you to think bigger about your societies and countries and about your role in a reconfiguring world. And I think it's one of the great opportunities in history, the opportunity facing all of you. Very few generations get to live in a moment of actual world transition, where the rules of everything get to be rewritten. And you are living in one of those times. The world is living through a leadership deficit right now. The old nations and old rules aren't working. So it's your turn. What will you make of it? Now I'm going to go eat some more sushi. Thank you.